So welcome to the third and final nightly Ivan Hour here at the 2022 ENC. For tonight's Ivan Hour event, we're very lucky to have a distinguished speaker, long time and very important career in the NMR industry. In fact, many of you have likely held a Toby Zens designed probe in your hands at one time or another. But Toby is here tonight to pay honor and tribute to well, one of the heavyweights in the business. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to David Rice. And Dave, if you would like to make the formal introduction, please.
Okay. I've known Toby since I joined Varian in 1993, and he joined Varian in 1980 to build probes, and had a little stint at Nalarak, and then built that company up, and then joined Varian again. And so I've known him for years, and he was also longtime friends with Wes Anderson, and so he is going to give a talk about Wes. And with that, I'll give the mic to Toby.
Thank you, Dave. I've got this here. Yeah. So just so we get everything figured out and get the ground rules started, this talk is not just about Wes Anderson, it's also about the history of Varian and how the players came to be. And I knew Wes, I never worked with Wes on a project, and actually only knew Wes very well from about 2005 up to, I don't know, maybe 2010 when Agilent purchased Varian. And the way I knew Wes was because when Nalarak was purchased by Varian, a bunch of us went down to Varian, and one of my colleagues, Athol Gibson, got involved with Wes worrying about DNP and things like that. And then also a friend of mine who is now working at SpaceX, saying he's responsible for every electron in the Falcon capsule. I don't want that job. No, thank you. And so anyhow, we got involved with Wes and his wife, and we became socially interactive. We'd go out to a restaurant in Palo Alto and eat dinner. And so I got to know Wes and his family fairly well. So one of the things I wanted to point it out here is that in all of this, many of the early Varian pioneers served in the service during World War II. Wes did not. If you subtract 28 from 41, you'll find out that he was at a young age, still too young to be drafted. But many of the other ones, such as Jim Schullery, and then again, some of the others were drafted. So that's the thing I wanted to point out. Now, the one other thing about this, when you look at this, and I did talk to Wes not too long before he passed away, you know, you just see his life and what it's like to get old and things start working as well and whatnot. And so it really kind of got to me thinking about it all. So I get a little bit emotional. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is right now. So anyhow, let's go to the next slide. And so this sort of gets into the emotional end of it. I have on the right what I call the human condition arrow. And I say it keeps moving every day, every second, and sometimes up and sometimes down. And now that I am 77 years old, I know that it won't be that many more years before I can't see its movement, okay? And so I do know that its movement is marked by what we do to help mankind, and especially now with the war in Ukraine. I don't think it's moving in a positive direction. I call it a moral outrage. That's how I personally feel about it. I've written every congressman and senator that I can think of in the state of California. And I just expressed my fear of what's happening. But I know Wes contributed a lot to better the human condition. And I just know that his contributions won't go unnoticed by all who knew him or all who learn of his accomplishments in the future. So all of that being said, let's move to the next slide. So there's a picture of Wes, probably at the prime of his career, in the Varian Library in 1975. And the reason I chose that picture was that I wanted to talk about how he got to that position. And so he was born in Kingsburg, California, which is about 30 miles southeast of Fresno, mostly south. And his mother was a nurse and his father was an agriculture loan officer. And he grew up on a raisin farm. Now, one of the problems I have with raisin farms is I have no idea what grapes they grow. If somebody knows, please tell me. So if you're in California today, and I live in Monterey, and you drive south, I go south to Santa Barbara often to see one of my friends down there. All you see is grapes growing in every direction. And you sometimes wonder how there could possibly be that many grapes grown. But then you look around here and everybody's got a glass of something in their hand, so we all know where that comes from. Anyhow, so he at an early age constructed electrical circuits and he used rural telephone batteries to do it and power them. And throughout his youth, he was always involved in home projects that included circuits and radios. He actually worked in high school in a radio repair shop, crystal radios, regular radios, radio tubes, everything. He was involved in all of that. And throughout his youth, he was involved in these home projects. And he was encouraged by an uncle who was a radio enthusiast, et cetera. And that probably fueled most of what he did in high school. And then in high school, he enjoyed chemistry and physics and was encouraged by his teacher to apply to Stanford University for college. And West attended Reedley College for 2 years and then applied to Stanford. Now, I looked up Reedley College to see if it still existed. It does. And it's part of the very large junior college circuit in California. I think we had something like 250 junior colleges in the state of California. It's immense. Anyhow, he attended Reedley College for 2 years and then applied to Stanford University. He completed his bachelor's degree in physics with distinction in 1950. And then he applied to graduate school at Stanford and received his master's degree in physics. And after his first year, and then he selected Felix Bloch, who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his contribution to the discovery in NMR, as his PhD advisor. In his second year in graduate school, he spent the summer working for Varian Associates in California and mapping magnets fields with NMR equipment. And then also in his second year, he got married to Jeanette Arndt, an education major who was taking graduate courses at Stanford. Now there's a picture of Wes and Jeanette. And one of the things that really impressed me about Jeanette was that she was a fantastic photographer. She would send you these photographs on her Christmas cards. And one year she sent one, which is a picture through the windshield of her car of a leaf. And you just looked at this thing and you couldn't believe how beautiful it was. And it was just fantastic. She was a graduate of Pomona College, the same college that Jennifer Doudna, who wrote the CRISPR stuff, came from, one of the Claremont colleges. And so a very nice couple. Anyhow, next slide. So in his third year, Professor Bloch, who had won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the discovery of NMR, asked West and fellow graduate student James Arnold to build a new spectrometer that was capable of detecting protons with the aim of being able better to relate spectra to the chemical structure of molecules. Now, one of the very interesting things about Jim and Wes is that from graduate school in the time till they retired, they were together the entire time. And I didn't work with Wes, but I did work with Jim. And I did work with Jim on working on zero susceptibility materials. And he also did this wonderful probe in CERN called the Racetrack NMR probe, and it used inductive coupling. It was way ahead of its time. And the other thing about Jim was that he was very understated. And one of the guys, who we'll see in a minute, told me, unlike Wes and somebody's a bit older, more like Jim Shorey. He was a top gun in the Navy, fought in the Battle of Midway, came back, went to school at Stanford. Anyhow, I haven't seen Jim, and one of the problems with this talk is that just about everybody in it is dead. And the history is fading. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. Anyhow, so it turns out that Wes actually did the first spectrum of ethanol and was the first spectrum of coupled ethanol, showing the actual coupling of all the peaks. And while at CERN, Wes did this experiment, and this is basically a I don't know, a reconnection or whatever of something that Ray Freeman said. And it shows here 2,3-dibromopropene, and it's a homonuclear double resonance experiment. And you might say, well, a double resonance experiment is where you can decouple protons and look at carbon, but it didn't manipulate the spectra. It didn't change how the spectrum looked. And so this experiment shows you how they can actually see that there was correlation between the various elements in the spectra. And so here he decoupling the methyl CBRH2 group and seeing a change in the far right multiplet on the right, and you see there underneath it the result of two doublets. So that allowed them to see this correlation. And as Wei says, this was clearly a demonstration of correlation between the spins, and it can be argued that this manipulation logically led to Jenner's demonstration that double resonance experiments could be more efficiently done by 2D NMR, and this led to what is now standard spin choreography, which is part of modern 2D NMR techniques. And this is pretty serious stuff considering when it was done. Anyhow, so then after Block said, well, you know, I want to move back to Palo Alto because I hate this administrative stuff I'm doing at CERN. And he did. Then both Wes and Jim were faced with moving back to Palo Alto or wherever. And so Wes moved back to Palo Alto and started working again at Varian Associates and began to work again on magnetometers, which were used in anti-submarine warfare and also to detect landmines. And this got him a deferment out of the Army, which was a good thing. And I actually checked to see what year that was. It's 1955. So the Korean War was over. It ended in 1953. So he also began work to improve the resolution of NMR magnets and to use them for chemical analysis. And he found out that there are some people that suggested that spherical harmonics were a good way to try to do this. And he's constructed a set of shim coils that would lay flat on the pole pieces of the magnet, which is important. And anyhow, when he did that, on the left, you can see this early Varian NMR shim set. Now, it turns out that occasionally I have this pleasure of driving to Albuquerque and visiting ABQ and MR, where Aichi Fukushima and Mark Conradi reside. And so when I was visiting there, Mark says, oh, Toby, I have to show you this. And he goes over to this iron magnet, pulls off the shim set, and sure enough, on the back is Wes Anderson's initials. So there it is. The backside where the initials aren't shown, so you can see the thing on it, the actual coils. And then, of course, Wes also at that time started constructing zero susceptibility materials by placing diamagnetic and paramagnetic pieces, conductors together in close proximity. And this improved the resolution of probes. Now, I have to say that when I was at NALARAC, that was a problem. And I had to learn how to do a lot of plating. And I became an expert in plating materials. I really know how to do this. And in fact, I even tell the Japanese people how to do it. They don't like what I say, though. Anyhow, so that's that part of it. And so now they had a magnet that could be shimmed well with a good set of shims. And so in 1960, after they figured out how to do things like put a super stabilizer in the magnet and various other things, they came out with this first analytical instrument. And I can remember when I was an undergraduate doing NMR on this thing. And I did things that kind of messed things up, but I'm still alive. I guess that's what counts. But anyhow, that was a very big deal. And then Martin Packard, who was the person that was so nice to get the first dip in the trace on the oscilloscope showing that there was a magnetic resonance. He ran back while Bloch was talking to somebody about nuclear moments and things like that and saw something that was much more important. He managed to say, oh, I only think it'll sell a few hundred units, but they sold over 1,000. So that was a very big deal. So here's what I call the Magnificent Seven. And I'm going to talk a little about each one of them. As I said, I've also already worked with Jim Arnold. And in 1980, when I was at Varian for the summer, Richard Ernst was visiting, and I met him in his office. And very, very briefly, I mean, it was like maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I can't remember. But interestingly enough, at the ENC in Pittsburgh, which you remember well, he came and ate breakfast with me and asked me how I was doing on all the probe stuff and everything. He was really quite a considerate guy. And then there's Ray Freeman, who I've talked to a little, but not extensively. Also a very talented guy and also a lot of very great students over the years. And then there's Howard Hill, who was my boss eventually at Varian. And then, of course, there's Jim Shulry. And Jim was not a physical chemist. He was basically an organic chemist. He was a guy that you couldn't think of doing anything that was terribly physically chemical related, but he was very much pushing all the things all the time to get the instruments more usable and much more capable of doing chemical analysis. And then there's Martin Packard, the guy that actually saw the first NMR trace at Stanford. And he would show up at our lunch table every once in a while and look at you and say, what have you done for NMR today? And at that point, you wanted to shrink under the table, of course. And then, of course, there's Wes on the far end there at the library. So now we're getting into the part which is probably the most famous part for Wes, is the Fourier transform NMR. And a lot of people don't realize that Russell Varian actually patented this in his initial patents for NMR in 1956. A little about Russell Varian. Because we had the quote Varian award every year, and Russell was basically the guy whose name we used in that. He was a terribly dyslexic person. He was incredibly dyslexic, and he was literally not allowed into the physics program at Stanford, even though his name is on the side of the building. And so that's a very interesting thing. But his idea was to use a broadband excitation method, and then there were too many frequencies. And so when you tried to collect them all and digitize them all in some way, it just became impractical to do it. It was just too long and too difficult to do. So Wes got involved, and after several attempts, Wes produced the idea of using short coherent RF pulses that could excite the spins while the resulting FID was heterodyne down from the carrier frequency. And then even though the scheme was advantageous, the process of digitizing the signal remained cumbersome. And slowly the kinks of the process were worked out. And when the advent of small laboratory computers became a reality, the NMR signal to noise, once they got everything working, increased by a factor of 1,000 for the same time of data accumulation. And this is obviously in concert with Richard's efforts. And what I don't know from the literature, and this is the part that's kind of hard to get at, and maybe there's somebody around who actually knows, and maybe Howard would remember, I don't know. But the thing that's interesting is that according to Ray's reports and other reports that Martin Packard did, and then Wes himself, he said, oh, I just told Richard to do it. I just can't imagine somebody saying, oh, just do this, just a small little thing to do on the side. But he did do it. And he came there as a postdoctoral student in 1963. And he was keenly interested in improving the sensitivity of NMR And frankly, it's rather amazing he persevered in accumulating the signal and then transferring it to a tape and then to IBM punch cards. And they literally took all the data, transferred to the tape, made the ID punch cards, and then took it off across the town to have some computer facility do it. And they came back with a spectrum. Pretty amazing. And so basically at the end, this is how Richard won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for doing all this. And also he applied it to MRI. And I want to go back a slide here, if that's possible, and talk a little more about Ray Freeman. Ray came to Varian in 1962, and he basically sent out some sort of note to everybody saying he was interested in taking a position somewhere else. And Wes and Martin Packard responded, so he chose Varian. He came for 6 months and stayed for 12 years. So that's how that happened. And so when you look at this, the brain power of it all, you just say, how can anything go south? But it did. Anyhow. So there's another guy who I work for, and everybody there I'm pretty sure knew. And again, the history is kind of hazy because you can't quite figure out what position he had and whatnot. Now, Bob Codrington joined Varian in 1962, about the same time the others in the previous slide did. And he was a Canadian who got his undergraduate degree from UBC and served in the Canadian Navy. Then Second World War, got his master's degree in mathematics from UBC. And then for reasons that are not clear to me, he got his PhD from Notre Dame. Then he taught at Rutgers for a while. And in the history of him, what you see is he taught at Rutgers, and he did experiments with Albert Einstein and Oppenheimer and Torrey and others. So it's really quite high level stuff that was going on. And then he was named to be the, I don't know quite how to say what it is, but before I get to that paragraph there, he was supposedly promoted to a position at Varian, some engineering manager of the instrument division. But it's not clear, and from other reasons that I can tell you about, it's not clear that he was actually managing the significant seven there. It's hard to say. But anyhow, he was a very wonderful man, and everybody really loved him. And he spent a lot of time recruiting new talents, such as George Gray, Steve Smallcombe, myself, Lynn Batchelor, David Foxhall, just to name a few. Now, I attended Bob's memorial service, and one of the things that I remember very vividly is telling my wife, Linda, I said, we're driving up some hill in Los Altos Hills, and I said, when we get there, we're going to see a lot of really old people like me, and I don't want you to be terribly surprised. Well, there were a few old people, but the interesting thing was there were an awful lot of young people there, and I talked to all these guys, and what I found out was all of them had been recruited by Bob at some point, which was extremely interesting. Anyhow, one of the things that Bob put in my life, which I very much remember, was that he talked to me about this reentrant probe cavity, and from that came the idea of the 1 NMR probe. So I'm just saying that was a very interesting thing. And I last saw Bob in about 1998, I think it was, at a Varian old timers meeting. And that was it for that. And 2 months later, I found out he had passed away. Okay, so I mentioned about Wes and his new position there at the Varian Systems and Techniques Laboratory. I've never heard that term used before. Everybody at Varian called it Varian Central R&D. I have no idea where that came from. But anyhow, in 1972, Wes was named the manager of that laboratory. And a new position came after a brief departure from Varian due to a management malfunction. He was laid off. And the thing that's so funny about it is that everybody I talked to, including Wes, cannot find out why. But I did find out in talking to people. Phil Horning told me, he said, well, the guy that supposedly fired him, Peter Llewellyn, who also passed away. So I can't find out from him. And the thing that's so funny about Bill Horning says, well, Peter told me that he was really laid off. Now I have no idea why that would happen. What I can imagine is that the bean counter said, well, we got all these eggheads over there, the Magnificent Seven, and why are we paying all these people when nothing's coming out that we can sell? Which they didn't look at that in a positive way. And anyhow, so he was named 2 weeks after he was laid off to this new position, which he remained the manager of for the rest of his career. And so that's a very interesting thing as well. So in his new position, which wasn't an NMR, he immediately started getting into ultrasound cardiac imaging, which became a rather big thing at Varian for a while. And they demonstrated this to the doctors at Stanford and at UC Berkeley, and they wanted a unit for evaluation. And then he also switched gears a little bit and got involved in the development of the rotating anode X-ray tube. And that was a pretty big thing for the Varian Medical Division because these X-ray tubes were heating up. And when they heat up, the electrons that hit the anode literally dig a hole, the cathode to the end, literally dig a hole in it. So if you rotate that surface around, it spreads the wear out. And so they could last a much longer time. And that was a very desirable thing as well. So one of the things that strikes me, and this is kind of like how companies are managed, Varian was always sales oriented. The managers generally came from a sales background. At Agilent, it was the other way around. The management was all basically marketing, and they had their own sales division. And so it's a very interesting trade-off. And one of the things that always got me about Varian was that they seemed to always have their head in the sand. I can remember, I said I came to Varian in 1980, but actually I came there to work for the summer. I shared an office with Gareth Morris at that time. I went back to Tulane University and came back in the fall. And head of Varian, Norman Pons. Oh, well, you know, we've decided that mainframes are the future. The very next year, Apple came out with their little computer. And the next year after that, I bought my first IBM PC. And literally after an ENC, stopped in Scotts Valley to get a disk which had Turbo Pascal on it so I could do some field calculations, et cetera. So it just shows you how ahead of the time they were thinking at the time. So it's really a problem. And I think it continued that way for a long time. Anyhow, so Weston on education. As I said earlier in the talk, I didn't work on any projects with Wes. However, I did stop by his house early before we were supposed to arrive for dinner at a local restaurant. And basically Apple's wife and my wife and Jeanette did something, and we all showed up at this restaurant, which was on El Camino. And so Wes took me around and showed me his workshop and showed me all the projects he was working on with the kids in the neighborhood. And he stated that a number of times that the kids today are not interested in how things work and their cell phones and computers. And I really think that is a problem. And I don't know how to stop it. Now, Ron and I were discussing this at sort of dinner, and we came up with the idea with these programming things that Apple has now where you can program, and then maybe you can take the programming and turn it into something that you can make a circuit out of, et cetera. And that the kids can see how the cell phone works or the computer works or something like that. But that's a pretty important step. Now, the last thing that I wanted to point out that is that Wes and Jeanette contributed on an annual basis $15,000 to the Kingsburg High School scholarships. And he was a wonderful person who gave back to his community. And that's a really, I think, important thing. And so, oops. And at the memorial for Wes in Grover Beach, Wes's daughter and son said that Wes was always making gadgets around the house. And Lucy and Joel said that he was 50 years ahead of his time. Now we have Alexa, but 50 years ago, Wes had his house wired so we could always tell if a door or window was open or closed. So nothing really changed from when he was a kid in Kingsburg making all these circuits to this. And I think that's really the key. And so I guess he didn't stray from the young kid that he was, involved in electric circuit projects. And then the last slide was one that was taken before his memorial, actually before he passed away. But there he is, enjoying ice cream at 93. That's just fantastic. Anyhow, so because I did this talk and I want to be another person who gives back to the community, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Varian Young Investigator Award. And this is an award that was started by Howard Hill and myself and Chris Murphy and Ernest Wong, Dan Iverson, Lima Baltisis, George Gray, Steve Smallcombe, Toby Zens, and this guy, Dave Rice. I forgot to put your name in. I can't remember anything, Dave. Anyhow, the goal of this award is to reward young researchers in magnetic resonance for their effort. And the award is given out on even number years at Euromar and odd number years at Asilomar. And we just gave out the award for the 4th time at Euromar. And we will be giving it out next spring at Asilomar. And you can contribute to this award at Asilomar if you contribute through the ENC. It's a tax-deductible 501c organization. And as Joanna Long has probably already showed all of you, that you can nominate someone for this award as well. And one of the things that kind of a little bit getting under my skin about this award, it's not a bad thing, but when Howard Hill and I came up with this idea when we were sitting at the Duke of Edinburgh pub right across from the Apple spaceship in Cupertino, we were kind of thinking of younger people. But what has happened now, this is obviously the quote young professor award, and some of them aren't so young, some of them are almost 45. So that's kind of trying to figure out, and the reason for that is that we allow for childbirth years for women, et cetera. So there's a good reason for some of those things to happen. But what it is just the young professor award, basically, because this year, the ones in Euromar, and there were 8 candidates, and all of them were just fantastic. You could have taken a quarter and flipped it. It wouldn't have mattered who got it, really. They were just that good. And so my reaction is, well, there's nobody in industry that may be doing really great research, but we have no idea because they don't have 50 publications. Nobody in industry publishes 50 papers. So we don't know how to, we need to somehow arrange this so that it's not quite so one-sided. And if you have suggestions, I would really appreciate hearing about them. So anyhow, thank you very much for your attention. And I hope you learned something about Varian and Wes.
And actually, I'll ask you your questions.
Uh-oh.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for the wonderful talk. I feel like in the early age when the fields just started, everything's so exciting. And like now back looking time as a young scientist, what do you think that can keep the younger generation excited and preserve this longevity of for passion for research? Because if you think about that, right, in the beginning, everything's so new, so great. Now, for a younger generation, look, there's just so much to learn already, and how do we feel we're gonna do something for the future that is so great compared to a lot of stuff already being done that is fantastic?
Well, I don't know quite how to answer that because you see people like Alex Pines, others Alex is no longer active at Berkeley, but did a lot of work. What I can say for myself and some others, I just love what I was doing. And after a while, you just start making things and people know who you are doing what you're doing. And, it's very gratifying. I mean, last year at the ENC, I was at not last year, but the last time we were in Monterey, we had a dinner in a very different place from normal, but basically it was a very big place. And somebody came up to me and said, "You're Toby Zens?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I still have some of your probes at Merck," which I haven't been to Merck in 20 years, and they still work. I'm amazed, and he thanked me for all that. And this keeps happening. But the other thing I will tell you is that we recently hired 2 people. One of them is now working at Joel and Peabody. and the other one we just hired. And both of these people came out of Sanjay Han's group, and they're fantastic. And they will do great things. I have no doubt about it. And they're so much better than I was at that time. So I really do believe it, that, you know, things will move on. But again, it's persistence and patience and just keep it to something you like. You know, I mean, I love building probes. When I started building probes, it was chemistry, physics, and electronics. I was just, you know, just wonderful. So it's, you know, if you think about people who are really excited about what they're doing every day. I mean, I go visit Mark Conradi at ABQMR. He's like a kid in a candy shop, you know, and they're not doing high field NMR. They're doing imaging on roots of sugar beets, you know, and he just loves it. You know, it's just so cool for him. You know, so when you find something you like, do it, you know, and, you know, money isn't everything, but it helps.
Other questions? Okay, well, let's thank Toby again for a great talk.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, John.